Okay, so we're going to talk about changes over time. One of the most common purposes to, or reasons to build a poverty measure is to track progress. So let's see, at the poverty and see how it changes across time. So that's why I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So once you have the measure, what you're going to do with the measure? One of the things that you do with the measure, you keep measuring it period after period and you compare. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit. And I have it's divided in two parts. Although honestly, I'm going to be mostly on the first part. Poverty data tends to be mostly repeated cross-sectional data. What do I mean? We have different surveys in different periods with different samples. Rarely, it happens, we go and we have data for the same people, so we don't track the same people. That would be panel data, and there are. But the most common data sets that we use, like the ones that you've been using, the HS and mix, they are repeated cross-sectional. So you have a sample in 2010, you have another sample in 2015, and so on. And so what I'm going to here mostly focus is on what type of descriptive analysis you can do with that data. And saying a little bit of what you can't. In the second part I'm going to go, but if we have panel data, if we have data for the same individual in different periods, what we could do a little bit using this framework. So that's it. First, actually there is a little thing before this, before going into notation. One thing that the global MPI that it's published, every year, every time we get a new data set, we build the MPI with the best possible MPI with the information that we have. What happens is with the HS and mix and in most surveys, as time goes on, there are little changes. Sometimes one question is changing, other times maybe you only collected nutrition data for children and now you start collecting for women. So there are these changes. And when we do global MPI, we just focus on the period, on the data set that we have, and we do the best we can. But then if we want to do changes, compare two periods, we have to make sure that all the parameters are the same. Why? Let's suppose that in 2010 we computed the global MPI for a country and we had only data for children. We had only nutrition data for children. And we computed the indicator of nutrition just based on children. What happened what did we do with households that did not have children? Now it's a moment for a shout. Not deprived, exactly. So we assume that households where there was no children on the age from 0 to 5, they were not eligible to this indicator, and so they were automatically considered non-deprived. And we got our poverty measure. Let's suppose that 5 years later, we have a new data set, new survey, that now they have actually measured the BMI. So they went and they weighed and they took the height of women of reproductive age. And we go, if we compute the global MPI, now with a nutrition indicator with children and women, and then we saw that the poverty actually went up in 5 years. What type of conclusions can we draw? We don't know. Because what happened? Some of the households that we before said that they were non-deprived, now they might be deprived. But maybe they were deprived back then, but we just we didn't measure it. So that's why. And so if I would compare these two things that are non-comparable, I might say, oh, this country performed really bad. But it's not true. It might not be true. It might be true, but it might not be true. I just don't know. So that's why the first step before changes that I'm not going to cover here is harmonization. When you want to compare 2 points in time, you have to make sure that your measure is exactly the same. Sometimes there might be small changes on the questions, but at least you have to keep a record. And when you assess your results, see if those little changes can affect The big changes you cannot. Like, so if I want to compare these two countries, the nutrition women for women, I have to drop it on the second period because otherwise I cannot compare. So I have to ignore it and build a comparable MPI just with the information of nutrition for children, 0 to 5, and then I can see a comparison. So that's what I'm not going to do. Other thing that you have to make sure that you also do before you go into analyzing the changes is the structure of the survey. You have to also see if the structure of the survey, of the two surveys, you can combine in a meaningful way, so that you can actually make inference based on what we saw here, the cluster, not based, taking into account the clusters and the strata and the weights. So those two things is before everything. Here I come when you already have the harmonized data and you have the two figures. What can we do? Some notation. So I'm going to focus that we have two periods, T1, T2. Let's make it easy. X, T1, X, T2 are the matrix of achievements for one period, for the other period. So this is the point. We have the same exact parameters, same indicators, some deprivation cutoffs, same everything. I'm going to present some expressions that should be, they'll probably be familiar to most of you, but I'm just going to basic refresh of basic concepts. I'm going to present them for M0, for the adjusted head count, but they could be made exactly for the incidence, intensity, and the uncensored and censored head counts ratios. First, what is the first obvious thing that you do when you have two periods? You have the M0 for two periods on time. The difference. That is like the first thing. Did it went up? Did it went down? How much? Just M0 T2 minus M0 T1. Easy. The second thing, instead of presenting in an absolute way, you can see in terms of percentage. What percentage of the M0 went down? So just express the difference as a proportion, as a percentage of the M1. Why can it be, why do we look at the absolute and the relative? So the first one that could come, it's the absolute. What is the advantage of looking at the relative? Anyone has like some idea, some suggestion? No, okay. So there's no shout. Why? So suppose the country has a incidence of 50% in one period. And in second period, it reduced for 40%. What was the absolute change? This is a shout. 10 what? 10 what? Percentage points, great. What was the relative change? That's it was 50% to 40%. No, you're like this, I don't. It was 20%. The relative, so 10. 10 was the absolute change. But then you have to divide the 10 by the initial, that was 50. So 20%. Yeah, so I'm not confused. But now suppose another country that they have an incidence of 5%. And they reduce incidence to 4%. What's that absolute change? 1. So you think, oh my God, this country did really bad. But he didn't do so bad. He couldn't change 10%. If he would change 10%, it would be negative. So the absolute for countries who have really slow level of poverty might not be as meaningful. So you cannot compare, like, you can, but it's like, what does it mean? So in relative terms, the second country from 5% to 1% to 4%, it reduced the same, 20%. So it's just, it's good to see the two because of that. So if you are talking countries that have more or less the same level of initial poverty, the absolute tells you, oh, this has really reduced more than that. But if you are countries that are very different, the relative can be more informative of the effort, of the effort that the country did to reduce poverty. Then suppose that you have a group of countries. So we did this for some countries of the global MPI. But the DHS and the mix, they have their frequency is variable. So for some countries you have 2005 and then 2008. For other countries you have 2004 and 2009. So when the reference, the period, varies, like just looking to absolute and relative, again, is not comparable. Because for some countries, I'm thinking about what they changed in 5 years, and for others in 3. So just because of that, when you are doing this type of analysis with several countries, with different time periods, you have to think about annualized. So you compute the annualized absolute rate of change. So how many percentage points, what was the reduction absolute in each year, or the relative, which is a bit of a more complicated formula because you are talking always the percentage of the previous year. But that's it. So let's suppose that you or the analyst, you had like this information, and they would come to you and say, what was the country that performed best in reducing multidimensional poverty of these 4? What would you say? What would be your like guess? This is a moment for a shout, in case you. There are only 4, so there is a 20% chance that you will get it right. Just Nepal. Why? Why? You have the both. Actually, this is more or less straightforward because Nepal has performed best in both terms of absolute and relative. E reduced poverty highest than the other 3 in the 2. If I would ask you between Peru and Rwanda, then you could start to having doubts and say, whoa, tell me what's the criteria? Because if I say in absolute terms, Rwanda did much better, but in relative terms, Peru did better. And it's just because they start from very different points. In Rwanda, they started from a poverty on MPI of 4.460, and in Peru, 0.085. So there, yes. It depends on the criteria. They might have done, like, depending on what you decide it's the best. They both did very well. How do I interpret the 4.1 of Nepal? I didn't know this. Nepal. What does that mean, that figure there? You know.
4% of population were before in poverty or not anymore.
Yes, that's a good way. Yeah, by year. So it's a 4% of the population, so it's 4 percentage points. So the incident has reduced 4 percentage points every year. If the 6.9, again, remember, it's 6.9% per year that is reduced. So it was a very way of putting it. Now, if I would just ask you, in Rwanda, based on the information in this table, can we say for sure that the number of poor people in Rwanda have decreased between 2005 and 2010? Yes, it depends on the population growth. So I can see that the percentage of poor people has decreased, but suppose that the population of Rwanda grew faster than 4.4% a year. What's going to happen? It's going to be the growth of population is going to actually eat my increase. I have less percentage of poor people, but as my population grows, those might actually be a higher number of poor people. So in order to make an assessment on the number of poor, you have to look at the population. And so here we have, you apply the population, you look at the population, apply the incidence, and we see the absolute reduction. And you can see that in the case of Senegal, which actually didn't reduce poverty, because the change, it was 0. So looking at that, I said, oh, it didn't change. It stays the same. But in absolute numbers, the number of poor increased. But on the others, we saw they all decreased. All decreased, but not as much not at the same rate that incidence decreased, because in all of them there was a population growth. Dimensional changes. So as I said in the beginning, you can apply exactly the same formulas for 2 head count ratios. So here we have the raw and censored, and now we say it uncensored, head count ratios. So which were the indicators that are reduced most? Shout. It's easy. Assets, I would say, and electricity. They seem like they are pretty. This is the absolute, so it's minus 0.5 percentage points and 4.5 for both. Here, assets is a bit different. So, can we see all this? Now, my question would be, which of these 10 indicators contributed most to the reduction of poverty in Nepal? Exactly. This is a bit more tricky question. And the answer, it's here if you know the weights. If you remember the weights. So, mathematically, the change in M0 can be written as a weighted average of the changes on the censored head counts. Change in M0, the weights that each indicator has in the MPI, and the change on the censored head count ratio of that indicator. So we sum. But as the weights are there, it means is that different indicators have different contributions to the change. In the case here, you have to keep in mind, although electricity and assets have reduced fast, nutrition has a weight 3 times higher than those indicators. So it means that one change of 1 percentage unit in nutrition is actually equivalent to a change of 3 in the other indicators. So if I would ask now the question, which indicator has contributed most to the reduction of poverty in Nepal, what do you think would be the answer? Nutrition. Because if you multiply this for 3, you see that this would be, in fact, much bigger contribution. Of course, not multiply, but in your head. The magnitude is much higher. But I have to say here, nutrition. But now there is another issue. What does that mean? So I said that nutrition was the thing that contributed most to reduce poverty. But what does that mean? What makes and what you would feel tempted to say, oh, the government has invested heavily in nutrition, so now the privations of nutrition went really down. And actually it might be the case here. But that would be like, if you say, oh, it's the biggest contribution, that would be like, would come like immediate. But you have to be careful. Why? Because you are looking at the reduction of the censored head count. But the censored head count, what makes the censored head count go down? And this is a question. Remember, the censored head count is the percentage of people who are poor and deprived. So, what can make that number go down? Shout.
Reduction of the intensity.
Reduction.
Reduction of the number of code.
Exactly.
Or the combination of code.
It's that. So a reduction on the censored head count, it's a combination of effects. It might be because, yes, there are less people deprived in nutrition, and so it would be a reduction on the intensity. So people would be more, could not be, but not just intensity, but yes, it could be, people are less deprived in nutrition, so the government has invested, and now people are not deprived of nutrition. Or it can be other thing. It might be that the government actually invested in education, and people got out of poverty, but the people who got out of poverty are still deprived in nutrition. But so the censored head count would not capture that, because now they are non-poor, so as they reduced poverty, the censored head went down, but they are actually still deprived in nutrition. Let's see if I can make it a little bit more clear. So this is a person, it can be two things, or I just said a poor person that was deprived in J stops being deprived in J, so it gets out that account that indicate. Or a poor person who has been deprived in J becomes non-deprived, but still deprived in J. How can I try to have a sense of which one might be driving this? Comparing the two. Comparing the raw and the censored. Because the raw will give you the changes of deprivations in the whole population. So if the nutrition went down in the raw, it seems like the percentage of people deprived in nutrition, of people living in households deprived in nutrition, in my sample, went down. So there was an improvement on nutrition. I'll come to you. So, how was I saying? So in nutrition, it's more or less the same. There was a reduction, and actually it's on all the population, there was an improvement in the deprivation of nutrition. But that improvement was actually bigger on poor. So poor people seem to be, the people who actually exit poverty stopped being deprived of nutrition. So it has fueled. But look at flooring. So in flooring, we saw that the censored head count reduced it a lot. But the raw head count, very little. What does that mean? No guesses. What does that mean? I have it written. It means what I was trying to say before, that the people who actually, so there was an improvement, as we saw before, Nepal has reduced poverty and has reduced incident. So there was people that were poor, stopped being poor. And the fact that flooring reduced it so much tells me that people who were poor were deprived in flooring. And now, as they are no longer poor, or because it improved, like the people who are poor have much less, in percentage, are less deprived in flooring. So the censored head count went down. However, when I look to the raw, it went down very little. So what it means is what that change is capturing, like your colleague said, is the people getting out of poverty. So the people are getting out of poverty, and these people were deprived in flooring. So my censored head count tells me, oh, flooring went down. But in fact, it didn't went down as much, because the people went out of poverty, but they are still deprived in flooring. That's why the raw head count that looks at deprivations in the population just went down a little bit. No, this is might not be straightforward, but what I want to transmit is be careful. When I put the formula and I say, oh, you can look at the changes of M0, looking at the changes of the censored head count. Mathematically, yes, but when you interpret, be careful. And the big contribution of nutrition might, in this case it was, but it might not be because nutrition improved. Before you say something like that, check the raw head counts. So check that the raw head count also improved. Otherwise, it might be just because people who stopped being poor are still deprived there. It was something else, some other indicator that improved. Questions? I think there are, but if we don't want to make it now, we can talk about it afterwards. Because as your colleague said, I'm not tracking the people. So I'm looking at averages. So there might be other things that contribute to these averages that I'm not capturing, like migration and demographic shifts, or maybe the profiles of the non-poor. So maybe change what I said before, oh, it's because nutrition, like the non-poor went so little down. But there might have been changes of the non-poor as well that that I'm not taking into account. When I'm saying this, I'm assuming that they are not changing, that they're keeping the same pattern. But so it might be more complicated than this. So we look at dimensional breakdown. Now we can go to look at subgroup decomposition. So we can start with a country like Nepal, in our star performance, and we know what they reduced. So I computed. And here, this graph, on Horizontal axis is the initial level of MPI in Nepal. It was 0.035. I don't remember which year it was, but now 2006. On the vertical, it is the absolute reduction. It was 0.03. But now we can look, as you've probably already done in the groups, and compute the MPI for each of the regions of Nepal. Let's see if toward the poorest regions we have make higher reductions or not. Why? Just to have an idea if we are converging. So we would like to think that the policy reducing poverty would like the regions would be poorest would be the ones having a biggest improvements in absolute at least. So they would be converging with the lowest, with the ones that are least poor. We can plot that. What does this graph tells me? Has Nepal reduced the inequality between regions or not? No, this is a big, complicated concept. But do you think that they are converging or not? Yes. Because if you see the ones that are more to the left, the ones with higher levels of poverty in the first year tend to be also much lower. So having much higher reductions, absolute reductions. So this is actually a good scenario. If you take the trend, yes. So the least poor region was the one that has a least lower reduction. Fine. We have been making more efforts where it needed most. And you might think that this happens. No, not always. Nepal is a good case. There are cases of the opposite, where you have the opposite trend. So the least poor regions will actually have the higher absolute changes than the poorest regions. Again, you also have to be careful. I'm again talking of averages, and I didn't say anything about population. But it's possible, I'm saying, oh, one of the regions has reduced its poverty so much, while the neighboring region has increased it a lot. Oh, they are doing really bad. It might be just the neighboring region actually had better conditions for the poor, and the poorest people migrate. And now, the poor, lots of them are on the other region, and so the poverty went up, while the one where they left went good. So when we look at this, I'm assuming that the distribution of the population has remained more or less the same, but might not be the case. And this is also important when you do urban-rural. You're looking at the changes, but you have to be careful if the shares have changed a lot and who migrated. And now this I've been using, it was to expose the basic concepts, and I've been using the examples of MPI. Now I'm going to talk a little bit, it's just exemplifying these concepts, but with one country, because if you would do it with your country, you would do it with one country, so I would not be comparing countries, but just one country. That's Sabine and Shuman did for India. Although the data, so for India we have 2 data points, and unfortunately the data is relatively old. We are hoping to update it this year. So we have 98, 99, and 2005 and 2006. Some of the indicators had to be harmonized. 4 indicators had to be harmonized. One, which will appear, has actually had to be replaced when it appears the same. The first thing they did, it was just let's look at the raw head counts. Let's just see at the deprivations, have they gone up and they gone down in the sample. And what it's saying, we are talking about a long period. So yes. Fortunately, there were significant changes in all the indicators. They all went up. So this housing is a new indicator because they didn't have flooring. So there was no data for flooring. Flooring was substituted by another indicator. So the first, you see the number between square brackets is the initial, and then you have the change. And the stars is the significant. So all the changes were statistically significant. Then another thing that might be interesting to do when you are doing it at national level is not just compute the test, the change. It's another thing that I didn't mention because I don't go into detail here. But of course, you should, if you are doing this seriously, which I assume you will, you need not just to report the averages. You have to report the confidence intervals and test the changes. So sorry, because I didn't emphasize that, but I would like. So here, in that column, statistical significance change, I report because we did the test. We compare it to the MPI in the 2 years was statistically different. And so we saw that it is. So we need to do that. You need to make sure that it's not enough to see the averages. You always have to test. And so that's why here and the MPI, they are all statistically significant. So, but then besides, if you're going to do it and test for a poverty cutoff, it is also good practice to test for different poverty cutoffs. So if I conclude that poverty reduced for a cutoff 1/3, would it be different if I had a cutoff of 20%, 50%? Just to see if this change is robust for different poverty cutoffs. And they did it for union, so you are poor if you are at least deprived in one indicator, 20%, 33.5. And it's always significant in all the indicators, in the 3 indices. And then they went to describe. So use the properties of the measure to describe how poverty changed. Again, remember that we are always talking about cross-sectional data, so I can only describe based on average. So what does that mean? I don't know, as your colleague pointed out, if those people that I measured in the first period, they actually became non-deprived, as I was saying, because the people that I'm measuring are not the same. So I can only compare average. I cannot say, oh, those people there, they exit poverty. Because my reduction, for instance, on incidence, suppose like in my first example, oh, the incidence reduced from 50% to 40%. Does that mean that 10% of the people exit poverty? No. It might be that 20 exit poverty and 10% entered poverty. So that cross-sectional data, unfortunately, I cannot answer. So what did they do? So they went to where poverty has been reduced across geographic regions, social groups, and household characteristic, and how, which it was incidence or intensity, which indicators. Let's start with the first. The first, they just look at the changes on the indicators as we did before, and they concluded, what does this map tells you? It's actually incidence that the southern states of India have actually done much better. So poverty, the incidence of poverty has reduced much faster on the southern states than in the northern states. Of course, they tested. So here it's with the percentages. And unfortunately, another thing that this shows you, and it's a bit sad, it's that the poorest region, Bihar, which is a combination, there's like they made some adjustments to the regions, was the one who reduced least. Although it's not really true, because there are some of the ones that were combined that don't even reduce. But from the ones that are here, it's the poorest performance. So that's a bit of a sad story. While the ones in the southern, as you see, the biggest reductions. Oops, strongest reductions. Then we did it across subgroups. Again, what's the story here? For instance, for the castes. If you were the analyst and you'd look to that data, what would be like? First thing is they seem to all have statistically significant reductions, although the Muslims only statistically significant at 10%. But what's the other thing that is there that it's also a little bit of a less good story? It is that actually the one that reduced the poorest group, the Muslim, that had now here you've got the MPI of 0.32, was the one who reduced the least. So it's the opposite of what we are seeing with the regions of Nepal, where the poorest reduced the most. Here is the opposite. Another thing that I'll improve next year, that we normally do when we present these decompositions, which I didn't, I apologize, is to present the shares. So at least at the initial point. So ideally, I would have there the shares. So you would have the, like, what's the dimension of the problem? It's always a problem, but if the Muslim would be like just 5% of the population, it would be a smaller problem than if they would be 30% of the population. So it's always good practice, although I didn't follow it, to present the shares. When you do this kind of decompositions, don't forget at some point present the shares. And the same for regions, which you probably already know, you probably already did it. But sorry, that's why I was talking about the castes, but I was talking actually about the regions. But the story is the same in the castes. The scheduled tribes who have the highest level of multidimensional poverty were also the ones who reduced the least. So it's just this type of descriptive analysis gives you these ideas. You can like see how the different groups actually have evolved across time. Oh my God. So I have to be a little bit faster now. Absolute reduction. It's the same, but across household size and across the education level of the household head. And in this case, for instance, you would say, oh, 12 years or more have such a small... household heads who have 12 years or more of education have reduced poverty so little. Don't worry, they have a really low level of poverty. We are talking about people that are, on average, well off. But if you look at the gender of the household head, the story is less positive. Again, it would have been good to have the shares there. How it has been reduced. One graph that we normally use, it's to compare the change in incidence with the change in intensity. However, please note that the axes have different scales. So the changes in the reductions on incidence, the scales you see, it goes from 0 to 3.4, and I'm sorry, it says percentage, but it's percentage points. And on intensity, it's actually between 0 and 1 percentage point. So, but you get an idea in relation to the other groups. And what this shows you is that at least these two, which are two of the southern states, have reduced both most or among the most. So they are more to your left and also more to the bottom. So they are two countries that have, the regions that have like performed both. Kerala, no. Kerala, no, it still performed very good because we saw that it was also one of the strongest reductions. But in their case, there was more about reducing the incidence and less change on the intensity. Again, you have to interpret this carefully because you are talking about averages. So I don't know exactly what, if the people have reduced, the specific people. In average, they have. You can do the same for the other groups. And then, as I saw in the first example, you can look at the indicators, at the changes in the censored head count ratios. However, to do it properly, again, keep both side by side to make interpretations. This was just to show how the properties of the Alkire-Foster measure can be used to make this kind of intertemporal analysis. Again, it's descriptive, you've made the averages. But it gives you already a sense of how the scenario has changed. Now, very briefly, so I'm not going to go into very detail, but I'm going to just give you a little bit of a flavor. If you have questions in the end, feel free to come to me and we can discuss it further. Suppose we have panel data. Panel data would be great. Panel data would be awesome because then you can really divide your sample in groups. You can know who has exit poverty, who has been constantly in poverty, who has been in and out of poverty, and who has never been poor, or who has gotten in and out of poverty. So you can where people were, where they are heading. And that allows you to answer a variety of questions. How are these groups, and I didn't say the groups, the chronic poor, the ones that are tend to be always in poverty, the churning, the ones that are one period out, another period in, the ones that were not poor and fall into poverty, and the ones that managed to exit poverty. So you can see how this changed. All these are different, not changed. How do they different? Are we talking about groups that are demographically different? How are their deprivation profiles? Are there types of poverty traps, like are deprivations that are common to chronic poor, that chronic poor always have? Once you become poor and you stay poor, does your profile of deprivation change? Do you become poorer, or you just stay there in the same level of like with 60% of deprivations and you stay there, or do you keep on falling? And then you can do this analysis also per groups, different groups. And when you look at changes, now I can identify who exit poverty. Like one of your colleagues said, it's the ones that are closer to, the ones with lower poverty. So am I taking out of poverty those that have a lowest level of poverty, the ones that are like between 33 and 40% of intensity, or I'm taking out of poverty the ones that are 80 to 100%. So these panel data will tell you what was the intensity of the people who get out of poverty. It will also allow to tell you if the change is because everyone got out of poverty, or there were ones that got out, others that got in. You can tell that difference. And that's it, yeah, mostly. And now it's just one formula to think about. Let's assume that we have a panel data with n individuals. So that's my sample. This group sample can be divided in 4 exclusive groups if I have only 2 times in 2 periods of time. Those who were never poor, are non-poor in period 1, non-poor in period 2. Those that are poor, ongoing poor, that are always poor, the ones who got out, and the ones who got in. So that describes my sample. How can I decompose M0 between these groups? So I have the change in poverty. What is the change that corresponds to the ongoing, the exit, and the ones that entered? So I can know like where have I actually made biggest improvements? In taking people out of poverty, or in reducing the level of deprivations of the poor? And it's very easy. It's just this. Although this formula is a mistake, I would give a prize who finds the mistake before we get to the mistake. So the change will be the average, the weighted average based on the shares of the groups of their changes. So the first group is the ongoing poor. So we look at the share of the ongoing poor, and we look at the change on their level of poverty. So their poverty in period 2 minus their poverty in period 1. This is basically the change on the intensity, because they still poor. They were poor, they still are poor. So the only change that might have happened is a change on the intensity. Have they become poorer or less poor? And so this will give me that. Have I improved the situation of those people who are still in poverty or not? The second is those who exit poverty. So what's the change in the M0 of those who exit poverty? It was there, they were deprived. It would be the same. You could put M0 x AE T2 minus M0 x E minus T1. But in T2 is 0. They are no longer there. So there is no poverty in this group in period 2 by definition, because they are no poor no longer. They were poor in period 1. So those deprivations, that share of deprivations that these people had is here. So that was the change. That was the variation, and the variation and in the M0 that is associated with these people that exit poverty. So it's just that. So just the deprivations of these people, what were the deprivations that are no longer there. And the last group is the ones that entered poverty. So there might be this group that entered poverty. So they also contributed to the change. In period 1, it was 0. But in period 2, now they bring their new deprivations. Yes, please.
The last part, those who entered poverty, why is it you see 1?
Very good. good. You get the prize. That is the mistake. That is the mistake. Of course, it's not T1, because in T1 they were not poor. It's T2. Very good. You're paying attention. Oh, I'm so happy. So that was the mistake. So yes, please, in your slides, this is T2. Because if they entered poverty, that's the issue. In the first period, they were non-poor, so it was 0. So what's the change is actually that. It's the additional deprivations in period 2. Last slide. With cross-section, so what I just, this type of analysis of saying, oh, what's the deprivations on increasing on the ongoing and the ones that exit and don't, you cannot do it with cross-sectional data. There is no way. However, there are some approach, some theory-based approach to decompose the M0 between incidence and intensity. So they make some assumptions. Let's assume that the intensity of the people who exit poverty was blah, blah, blah. And let's assume that this change on the age, it's actually people who just exit poverty. So making this kind of assumptions, they come to estimates on the contribution of incidence and intensity to reduce poverty. However, these estimates might be very inaccurate. So because the assumptions we are making, we don't know if they are true or not. So doing a panel data and doing the real thing, and then making this theory-based assumptions, we get very different values sometimes. So it's just my last idea is just you think about that. If you see this Shapley decomposition on poverty and things of that sort, be careful. These are based on assumptions that might not be true, or might not even be close to true in the core case. And that was it.